שלום לכולם ולכולן. ברוכים וברוכות לאירוע לרגל צאתו לאור של גיליון ל"ט 3 של כתב העת עיוני משפט של פרופ במשפטים של אוניברסיטת תל אביב. גיליון שמוקדש כולו לגברים וגבריות במשפט. לא כל גיליון של עיוני משפט זוכה לאירוע חגיגי, והחלטנו לחגוג דווקא את הגיליון הזה מכיוון שאנחנו מקווים שהוא מהווה סמן בחקר המשפט והמגדר. קול קורא ודוגמה עשירה שמהווים מהמאמרים שפורסמו בו לצורך הדחוף ולאופנים העשירים שבהם צריך ואפשר לחקור את מקומם של גברים ואת תרומתו של המשפט לעיצובן של זהויות גברויות מורכבות ונזילות. מי שמכירה את העבודה המחקרית שלי עלולה להרים גבה, ואכן כמה גבות הורמו, בשאלה האם תם הפרויקט הפמיניסטי והושגו כל ההישגים כך שהגיעה השעה לדון בגברים וגברויות. רק שלהבנתי הפרויקט הפמיניסטי הוא לא דן בגברים וגברויות, הוא פרויקט דל ומוגבל. במובנים עמוקים התיאוריות הפמיניסטיות שמתמקדות בנשים ובנשיות, כמו גם נשים בעצמן, עשו כברת דרך ענקית בעשורים האחרונים, בספק בעיניי אם נוכל לעשות עוד הרבה בלי לכלול את ההבנה המעמיקה בו זמנית האמפתית והביקורתית כלפי המחצית הנוספת של האוכלוסייה. אני בטוחה שההרצאות שנשמע היום יאוששו את הטענה הזו. אני רוצה להודות לפרופסור שרון חנס, דיקן הפקולטה שמכבד אותנו בנוכחותו, לפרופסור McGinley שהגיע אלינו מחול, לכותבות ולכותבי הכרך הנוספים שהגיעו היום ועמלו לכתוב מאמר ולהציג אותו היום בפנינו, לאורחי הכרך הגיליון הזה המעולים שזכיתי לעבוד איתם, אלעזר וייס, חגי פורט ואוראל שריקי, אחת מהן כלואה בבית המשפט העליון בשל שביתת העוזרים המשפטיים, לחברי המערכת, ל"ט של עיוני משפט והמערכות שאחריהן, ולגברת רית קוטרמן, מזכירת המערכת, שמובילה את המערכת לשיאים חדשים של דיוק ויעילות ושטרחה רבות על האירוע הזה. אני גם מסירה תודה למשרד פישר, בכר, חן, וולוריון ושות על התמיכה הנדיבה בכתב העת לאורך השנים, ולמרכז מינרווה לזכויות אדם ולמרכז אלצג למחקר בינתחומי של המשפט על תמיכתם באירוע הזה. אני מתכבדת להזמין את פרופסור שרון חנס, דיקן הפקולטה, לברך.
Toda Daphna. Thank you, Professor McGinley, for giving us the keynote speech. And I already apologize that I'm going to create in Hebrew. אז תודה לכולכם. מרגש אותי במיוחד לפתוח כנס של עיוני משפט. תודה לדפנה לא רק על האירוע הזה והכרך הזה, אלא גם על האירוע היפה שעשינו ל-40 שנה עיוני משפט. אני כשהייתי סטודנט, אז אחד הדברים שהכי רציתי זה להיות חבר בכתב עת של מערכת משפטית, ואז היה כתב עת שנקרא פלילים, אני לא יודע, אני חושב שאחד הגלגולים שלו עדיין קיים פה בפקולטה, אבל הם היו מספיק חכמים להיות הראשונים שניסו לגייס סטודנטים, ואז אני באתי לרעיון, ככה בצורה נאיבית, והעורך האחראי היה אנדרי מרמו, מי שמכיר את השם, הוא היה אז מרצה צעיר פה, ואז הוא ישב ככה זחוח בפינת החדר, עבד על המחשב שלו, לא היה אז אימיילים, אבל אני לא יודע מה הוא עושה שם, ואותי ראיינו שני סגני העורך, הוא שואל אותי שאלות, ואז הוא התערב ככה, הוא עצר כך שנייה, וככה בספיחות כזאת שאלתי, אולי תספר לנו על איזה מאמר שאתה אוהב. אני באותו זמן הייתי מאוד נסער ממאמר של חיים גנז על חובת הציות לחוק. ואיך שאמרתי את זה, אז פתאום ככה מאוד השתנתה הזכיחות שלו, וראיתי הפנים שלו עברו למוד השמדה. ובאמת הסביר לי למה טעיתי לחלוטין, והמאמר הזה לא הייתי צריך לאהוב אותו, ולא קיבל אותי. וההזדמנות הבאה שלי הייתה עיוני משפט. אז קבעו לי את היום של הרעיונות, ואז אני פותח את שמחתי מאוד, ואז ראיתי פתאום שיש לי מבחן בחשבונות באותו יום. זה על אותה שעה. אמרתי, טוב, הם הסתדרו, אז פניתי ליואב ספיר ולרננה לוי, שהיו אז הסגני העורכים. עומרי ידלין היה העורך, לא הכרתי אותו. פניתי לה, אמרתי, אולי אפשר למצוא, אני נורא רוצה להתראיין, נורא חשוב לי. אז אמרו לי, מצטערים, זה יום הרעיונות האחרון ואין גמישות ומאוד מאוד מצטערים. ישבתי בבחינה בחשבונאות, ואיך שאני כותב את הבחינה, נזכרתי שהיה סיפור, עכשיו אני לא מצליח לזכור מי היה הסופר. נדמה לי חיים פוטוק שהוא כתב את The Chosen, אבל עכשיו לא מצאתי את זה באינטרנט. אבל שם נזכרתי שהיה סופר שבאמצע, במקום לכתוב את הבחינה הוא כתב ספר. תמיד בתור ילד ששמעתי את הסיפור הזה, הטריד אותי איך הוא העיז כאילו להפסיד בחינה ולכתוב ספר ומה קרה עם זה. אז אמרתי לעזאזל הבחינה, אם הוא יכול לכתוב ספר אני יכול לצאת מהבחינה ולהתראיין. ויצאתי, הגעתי שם ליואב ספיר ורננה, לא חושב שהצטיינתי ברעיון, אבל זה שסיפרתי להם שוויתרתי על הבחינה, שעשה את הסיפור, וקיבלו אותי, וגם לזה יש לי סיפורים, וזה יהיה בכרך הבא של במשפט. אז תודה רבה,
Our event today presents all the papers included in the volume. We start with a session in English dedicated to Professor McGinley's paper, and then after a tasty break, we will have a second session that will be conducted in Hebrew and will include all the other papers. I am pleased and honored to present our first speaker, Professor McGinley. Professor McGinley is the William S. Boyd Professor of Law at the Boyd School of Law at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where she has taught since 1999. A cum laude graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School and an editor of the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, Professor McGinley clerked for the Honorable Joseph S. Lord III of the Eastern District of Pennsylvania and practiced commercial employment and civil rights litigation. From 1989 to 1995, Professor McGinley taught civil procedure and legal research, writing and analysis at Brookline Law School. She joined the Florida State University College of Law in 1995, where she served as Associate Professor of Law and Director of Skill Training. Professor McGinley is an internationally recognized scholar in the areas of employment law, employment discrimination, and disability law, and a leader in multidimensional masculinities theory, an emerging discipline that applies masculinities theory from social sciences to legal interpretation. After the presentation of her paper, Policing and the Clash of Masculinity, we will hear two comments by Professor Danny Kaplan and by Dr. Ophir, whom I will present before they talk. Hopefully, we will have some time left for an open discussion. Anne, please.
Thank you so much, Daphne. I just want to thank, can everybody hear me? Okay, so I just want to thank Tel Aviv University for inviting me to come. This is very exciting for me to be here. I'm really happy to be here and for making my travel here and everything as comfortable as possible. I'm going to start. I'm speaking in English. I know it's your second language. I'm totally impressed by all of you because I'm living now in Madrid and speaking Spanish a lot of the time, but I know it's not easy. So if anybody has a question or can't understand me, please just raise your hand and I'll go ahead. So my talk and my paper are called Policing and the Clash of Masculinities, in which I talk about masculinity theory and policing. So I'm going to start with a few. There are a lot of pictures here I hope that you'll find interesting. On the right, we have Michael Brown from Ferguson, which is in the state of Missouri, which is in the middle of the country. He was murdered, or I should put it this way, he was killed by a policeman. One day, he's an 18-year-old kid, and this caused a very big uproar in the United States because the sense was that he didn't really need to die. He wasn't armed. He was walking in the street. The policeman told him to move. He got a little bit belligerent and went up to the policeman. At this point, we're not sure what happened because there was no film. But what seems to have happened is he could have tried to get the policeman's gun, at least that's what the policeman says, and the policeman shot him just peripherally. The boy ran away, and then he turned to come back. And as he turned to come back, the policeman shot him 6 times and killed him. There was no attempt to revive, once he was down, to make him, to get him to the hospital. The man was dead, and they covered him and left him in the street for 2 or 3 hours on a hot day. This caused incredible uprising. At around the same time, a little bit 6 months later, Tamir Rice, the young man on the left, who was 12 years old, was playing in a playground. He had a gun. It was a toy gun. Someone called and said, this kid is in the playground. He has a gun. It might be a toy gun, but we're not sure. They called the police. Unfortunately, the person who answered the phone didn't convey that to the police that it could have been a toy gun. The police came right up. The little boy had the gun in his hand, and the police shot him 4 seconds after getting out of the car, killing him. His sister was there. The police took her and as she ran to him, took her and slammed her to the ground and picked her up and put her in the police car. We also have Melissa Williams, who's on the right, and Timothy Russell on the left. They were driving in their car. Police say that the car must have backfired. We don't know. But they heard something and they thought it was a gunshot. 10 police cars chased them, cornered them in a parking lot, and this man on the right, the police officer Michael Brello, killed them. He stood on the hood of their car and shot. Well, there were 157 shots, and I think he was responsible for 47 of them. We have Eric Garner. All these happened within the last couple of years. Okay, Eric Garner in Staten Island, father of, I don't know, 5 or 6 kids. He was selling loose cigarettes illegally in front of a drugstore in order to make some money. The police came up and told him they wanted to handcuff him. He refused, and they did an illegal chokehold on him. As they took him down, he was saying, and you can hear him saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And by the time they got him to the hospital, he was dead. Freddie Gray from Baltimore, a young man who had an intellectual disability because he lived in a very poor home that had lead in the paint, and he had been eating the paint. So he had a number of times, brushes with the police and had spent some time in jail for minor crimes. When he came out of his house, he saw a policeman there. The policeman looked him in the eye, and Freddie ran the other way. When that happened, a whole group of policemen chased him. They grabbed him. They handcuffed him and put him in the police truck. Unfortunately, they did not stabilize him, so that when they went around curves, his head kept banging against the sides of the police truck. Some people think it was intentional, called a rough ride. And by the time he got to the I guess they got to the police department and he was unconscious, so they took him to the hospital. It was only within a couple of minutes that this happened. Walter Scott from North Charleston, South Carolina, middle-aged man, has had almost no brushes with the police, but his car, the back light was out. A policeman stopped him, and unfortunately, when the policeman stopped him, for some reason he got afraid and he got up and ran out of his car. His family believes it's because he owed child support and he was afraid that they were going to arrest him because of that. A policeman shot him 7 or 8 times in the back and killed him. Now, the policeman originally said that he was going after the policeman and was trying to grab his taser, but someone came up with a video of the occurrence after that, and you saw that really what happened was that he was running from the policeman, and after the policeman shot him to death, he went and put the taser next to Walter Scott's body. Okay, so those are all about 2.5 years ago. This is about the time when Daphne called me and asked me if I would write, and I thought this was really interesting to write about this. Our latest victim was about 3 or 4 days ago. Jordan Edwards, 15-year-old boy. He was at a party where alcohol was being drunk, which is illegal in the U.S. The police were called. The police went into the party, came out, and saw he was in a car with other boys. He wasn't driving, and one of the policemen shot him in the head as they were driving away. Now, the policeman said that they were backing up and trying to run over the policeman, but interestingly enough, because of all the media coverage, we now have this situation where most of the police departments are getting what they call body cams that record what's going on, and the body cam didn't show that the policeman was lying. They were driving away, and now his shooter has been fired and actually arrested for murder. So we hope, well, we'll see what happens with that one. So, okay, so these are individual stories, but what about the data? Okay, so police departments do not keep data on police killings of civilians. So The Guardian, a newspaper which most of you probably have heard about in England, did a study originally. All we had was 5 months between January and May of 2015, but the study was interesting. It showed that 464 civilians were killed by police in the United States. 102 of them were unarmed. 29% of those killed were black, and they only represent 13% of the population. 14% were Latino, which is a higher number than the population, and 50% white, which is a much lower percentage of the population. Perhaps even more interesting is that unarmed blacks were killed at twice the rate of unarmed whites, 32% versus 15%, and 95% of those who were shot and killed were men. Now, interestingly enough, since then, the Guardian has continued its study, and it has a whole year of data from 2016. I hope this isn't too small or too light, but So if you look on the left, you can see that, of course, white males represent a larger group than black males, and there are very few women who are being killed by police. They're still 5%. But if we look at the per million population, blacks represent 6.6 per million, Latinos 3.23, and whites 2.9 per million. So there's a big difference in who's getting killed. Black males aged 15 to 34% are 9 times more likely to be killed than someone in the general population, but even more importantly, 4 times more likely than white men of the same age. Another interesting statistic is that 1/5 of those killed are mentally ill or in some kind of a mental health crisis at the time this is happening. So there was a lot of press over this, and there's an organization, a movement called Black Lives Matter, which started doing a lot of protesting. But what I want, and the protests are about blacks being killed by the police. But I have a thesis that yes, it is heavily dependent upon race, but it's not only race. That gender is also a key invisible factor in these killings, because it's black men who are the victims, and generally, in the very vast majority, white men who are the police who are doing this to black men. And I think this whole area of multidimensional masculinities theory will help us understand this, because no one is talking about gender in these cases at all. So let's go back a minute to the studies and investigations that have been done, bless you, to show that there was racial discrimination or implicit bias. A number of you are sociologists or psychologists or something. Well, there are a number of computerized studies where they show a picture. It looks like it's somebody or a video, and the question is whether, and you sit at a computer and you press a button or you pull a trigger if you're going to shoot that person. And the reason for shooting the person would be if you are personally in danger. Okay, so these studies are supposed to show that the person either does or does not have implicit, unconscious, or conscious bias against the person based on race. Unfortunately, these studies are all over the board. They're not very useful. They haven't really shown anything. In some of the studies, and remember, the people who are usually the subject of these psychological studies are students. They're not police officers. So in some of these studies, we'll find bias against blacks, and they measure the time and whether you did shoot, okay? And they find bias against against blacks, but others don't. And then there are some studies that use police officers, but those studies don't show any bias. Not particularly helpful studies. So what we have, yes. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, question. Has someone mapped out which universities have done the studies and seen whether some universities have a feel threat in other universities where they would be a more liberal atmosphere?
Yeah, what an interesting question, and I don't think they have, but I think that's a really interesting question because some of these studies I can remember is places like North Carolina, which is a much more conservative part of the country. But what's interesting is I don't think the universities, I don't think the professors are biased. It could be that these bunch of white students are, though, who are sitting there in the audience, but they're 20 years old. You know, they're not trained like police, so I'm wondering really whether these are very helpful. What we do have, though, is our Department of Justice, when called in, does do investigations of certain cities, city police departments, and during the Barack Obama era, they did a number of these investigations, very thorough investigations, and here's what we found. In Cleveland, where that young boy was shot, they found that there was unnecessary and excessive use of deadly and less lethal force, that there was excessive force against the mentally ill when called for welfare checks, and that they were using poor and dangerous tactics and taking unnecessary risks. Notice that there's nothing here about race. And as a matter of fact, the person who wrote this, or the group of people in the Justice Department who wrote this, said they did not want to opine about race. Now, Cleveland is a predominantly black city. Most of their cops are white, so I don't know, but, you know, that's there. But in Ferguson, there was a definite finding that race did affect. And once again, Ferguson is a smaller city and predominantly black as well. They showed a prevalence of unconstitutional practices that had a disparate impact on blacks. Blacks were subject to twice as many searches during car stops. There was 26% less likely to have contraband in their car, but 2.37 times more likely to be arrested after the search. There was overt intentional racial discrimination that was being shown in not only with the police department, where they were using racial slurs and stopping African Americans at a rate that was amazing for things like walking in a funny way, things like that. There was also in the justice department, in the justice system, there were arresting African Americans and then putting them in jail for not paying because they couldn't pay their fines, and they were using them. They found this Department of Justice found they were using African American population as a way of funding the justice, the courts. It was very, very corrupt. Okay, so let's step back and think about what's been going on in the U.S., in cities in the U.S. over the last 30, 40 years. I don't know if you know this young man here. This is President Ronald Reagan, who was elected in 1980. And there's a book written, I want to say it was published in 2010 by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow. She was trying to account for the fact that African American, we have a very large percentage of our population imprisoned, and it has grown dramatically over the last number of years, and it's the vast majority of people in prison are African American. Many more people, percentage in prison per population than in South Africa and many other places like Iran. I mean, it's amazing, the American prison system. Now, Ronald Reagan started the war on drugs. That was the term he used in urban black neighborhoods, which meant that the federal government, they passed a lot of legislation, and even into Bill Clinton's era, they were passing legislation that would give money to police officers for increased training, increased militarization, military vehicles and weapons, and they even were going into, the courts were allowing them civil forfeiture if you arrested somebody who you suspected was keeping something in their home. They could make them forfeit their home, and the price of the home, the value would go to the police department. We were creating incentives all going the wrong direction. At the same time, the courts interpreted what we call stop and frisk. In the United States, you need a warrant in order to stop, or at least you did before this, you needed a warrant in which you would show probable cause in order to stop someone and search them. Well, the police said, no, wait a minute. And actually the stop and frisk came a little earlier, but it's in the 60s, but it's been interpreted more conservatively. If you have what they call an articulable suspicion, the police do, they can stop you, okay? Well, where are the police? Where are they militarized? They're in the African American neighborhoods. We have a very segregated neighborhoods. And that's where they're doing stops. I read recently of African American teenage boys saying that I think they say that they're stopped about 8 times a day by the police, which is sort of amazing, okay? And then there's a favorable legal interpretation saying that this was okay, all right, in a number of other types of cases. Okay, so how does masculinities theory fit into this? Well, first of all, let me explain to you what it is. First of all, it's an outgrowth of feminist theory. This is not the male studies group of people who pound their chest and say, men are Tarzan or whatever. This is a group of people who say that feminists, we agree with feminist theory, but we think the feminists don't take into account individual differences among men and pressures on men to act in certain ways. So these people believe, and they're the biggest proponent of it in the U.S. is a sociologist whose name is Michael Kimmel, and he's done lots of work there, that masculinity is what we call a social construction. It isn't really what you're born with. It's not your body parts, as I say to my students. It's actually what we teach boys and young girls about how boys should be. Boys are taught to become masculine, and they have to prove their masculinity regularly. It's a difficult thing to do, and some of the masculinity theorists say they have to perform it and they must accomplish it. So one of the ideas of masculinities theory is that men as a group have power. We all know that from feminist theory. Men have power. But that individual men, because of the dynamics between and among men, often feel powerless, especially if they're economically powerless. And they need, as I mentioned, to prove their masculinity to other men to feel powerless. So masculinities theory is more about the relationship among men than the relationships between men and women. But it's really important, I would say, to understand these relationships and in order to understand how men treat women. And a lot of times men are using women in order to prove to other men their own masculinity. So workplaces are key locations for proving a man's masculinity to others. And you can certainly see that in the blue-collar workplaces. And there have been some really interesting studies at Harvard about trying to make workplaces safer, and that's really interesting about when men are trying to act more masculine, they don't say when they're nervous about something not being safe, and all that's really important to learn about. And of course, policing, the whole city is your workplace. Policing is a masculine profession. So the rules of masculinity, according to this theory, is kind of negative. Masculinity itself has not a lot of content. Don't be a woman or woman-like, and don't be gay. So you have to prove that you're neither of these things. Now, it's important to understand that we use the term masculinities in the plural because masculinity takes multiple forms, depending on your race, class, sexual orientation, geographical location, etc. But my definition of masculinities is this. It's a societal structure that emphasizes the superior of the masculine over the feminine. And one example would be workplace cultures that are built around male bodies. What I mean by that is, it's much easier for a man to work those long hours all day long if the woman's, has to be responsible for the children, etc. It's also a group of practices conforming to society's view of what is masculine. And it's the doing of these practices. So it's all those things together. So that's masculinities theory. Then I want to add on multidimensional masculinities theory, which is looking at masculinity as it's not one of your identities. We have many identities, multiple identities, and those identities affect how we're perceived, how we perceive ourselves, how we act, how we're treated. And not only do those identities affect us, but it depends on the context of the situation. The example I give my students is black males. Okay, in the U.S., we think of black males as having much more power than black females. They do in workplaces, especially workplaces that are like fire departments, right, that are traditionally male. But if you have a black male walking in a dark street at night, and a black female walking on a dark street at night, who's going to be picked up by the police? So the context is going to make a difference as to what power you have. So there's also in masculinities theory this idea of the hegemonic masculinity. Now, some people push back against this, but I think it's an interesting concept. Okay, so the idea is the person who's the most powerful, the best looking, not the youngest, but middle class, white. This is who the hegemonic masculinity is, the one with the power. Well, not every man can be like this guy. Okay, some of us try. I'm not one of them. Some of them try, but some of them can't make it. And some of them, because of who they are, really can't. So we have what we call oppositional masculinities, people who don't even try to be part of that hegemonic group, but who, in order to express and demonstrate their masculinity, engage in other types of behaviors, dress, etc. One example, and once again, I don't want to stereotype people, this is just examples, okay? Might be a group of urban black kids who are trying to look tough and in a certain urban black way in the U.S. And then you have the white blue-collar workers who are calling their bosses, who are the hegemonic masculinity guys, they call them pussies because they don't use their muscles to work. So pussy is a terrible term. Anyway, it's never mind. Okay, so let's move to James Messerschmidt. He's a criminologist who writes about masculinity. And he says, and this is true, that men represent more than 90% of violence worldwide. Some say 100, okay? I don't think it's 100, but anyway, close to that. That the salient predictors of crime around the world are both gender and age. And men tend to be, when we say gender, I mean sex, right? Gender of men, okay? And that men tend to age out of crime at different ages depending on their opportunities, their economic opportunities. But crime, according to James Messerschmidt, is the way in which men often accomplish their masculinity. And as I said, boys of different classes approach crime in different ways. So Messerschmidt says that white working class boys, he was working in England and he's done work in the U.S., engage in fighting in school. They don't study because they're not going to be able to use those wimpy courses because they're going to use their muscles later on. They're going to be blue-collar workers. They fight in school, okay? They demonstrate their superiority over gays and members of other races and engage in hate crimes. I'm not saying they all do this. I'm just saying this is their way many of their ways of accomplishing masculinity. Now, if they happen to get a job, they might work in in construction or something. This will eventually go away. They won't do it for their whole lives by any means. Interestingly enough, though, is police come from this group of people, okay, generally, all right? Minority working class boys tend to engage in street gangs and violence to accomplish this oppositional masculinity and to show the kid down the street that they're tough and not to get beaten up themselves. And they tend to live in those neighborhoods that I was talking about that are targeted by police. So we can accomplish masculinity also through policing and through crime, okay? So through policing, given what's going on with Reagan and after that, with this war on drugs, we see this hypermasculinity. We see the militarization in the neighborhoods. We see a sense of brotherhood that's developed among police and what we call the blue wall of silence. And that is, for those of you who don't know, that police tend not to tell on their other police if they've committed a crime. Okay, they protect their own. Angela Harris, who is a professor at Berkeley, says that police enforce the law against what they consider a community of savages, okay, and this is in the black communities we're talking about, and she even says that African American police join in order to get the privilege of the white police, all right? There's a need for dominance, an emphasis on solidarity, and a glamorization of violence among the police. Women who are police are not considered equal. They're denigrated. They are given female roles. Often they're the ones who have to fill out all the reports in the police department, and the male and female, if they're working in a car together, often they take on real gendered roles. It's kind of interesting. There's something called command presence that's important to be moved up in police, and it shows that you're masculine, strong, and you deserve respect. Police do demand respect, and any challenges that are made to police authority are considered to be challenges to their masculinity. And they engage in war on black neighborhoods. Here's a picture. I mean, this is pretty scary. You know, I'll be curious to hear what you have to say about the Israeli police. Okay. Okay, so how do the poor black men who are the victims accomplish their masculinity? First of all, I want to say that not all black men do this. Poor black men do this, and we're going to see that some of them do. They can engage in hypermasculine behaviors. They are stereotyped by the police and the community as dangerous and criminal. There is a stereotype in the U.S. of the bad black man and the good black man. The good black man is sort of a Barack Obama type, you know, really upper middle class person who's you know, a lawyer or a doctor or whatever. And then we have the bad black man who does not try to conform to society's rules. We have what we call a cool pose, which is oppositional masculinity. This is, I'll show you a picture of you know, how some young black guys engage in, well, you know, the hip hop, the cool pose. I'm into this, right? There's also the gangsta culture we're going to find, and some of these people actually do engage in crime, sometimes to prove masculinity, other times to support their families, because the research shows that economically they have a much longer period of time. They can't get jobs, and some of them actually do engage, obviously, in criminal behavior. So here are some gangsta symbols. They're pretty threatening and creepy, you know, from our point of view. But one thing I want to say is that all young men perform their masculinity in different ways. So if you look at this, these are performances of masculinity, but they don't seem as threatening to us. But I'm not sure that if I were a poor black kid, and this is, you know, South Carolina, and I were walking along the street and these guys were there, that wouldn't be threatening to me. You know, it's just that that's not where we have the police. Okay? So the clash of masculinities that occurs between the often mostly white male and the African American community, I think is happening on both sides. But what I want to make clear is that the victims do not necessarily practice those hypermasculinities. There's a stereotype that's transferred from the gangsta guys and the cool pose guys to these victims. If you see these victims, not one of them was performing a hypermasculinity at the time. So, but stereotypes of black men as threatening and dangerous, and some of them are fueled by black youth's masculine performances, are causing some of this, I think. Police are more likely to use deadly force when faced with black males, whether they're hypermasculine or not. Now, what are the solutions? Now, there have been a number of task forces. Obama had a task force, which I think had a lot of really good ideas, and it was connected to these Department of Justice. And one of them is a move to community policing, where the police know the people that they're supposedly helping, and away from the militarization. But no one said a word about gender or about masculinity. So this is where I'm coming in. I think we need to train police, and we need to grow our boys as young boys. We need to train them about this masculinity and what a foil it is in our community. We have to encourage new forms of masculinity, and we need to do empirical research on new models of policing. So what happened to those people that I showed to you at the beginning of my talk? Well, here's Michael Brown in Ferguson. The policeman was not indicted. The Department of Justice found no probable cause to indict. So usually the Department of Justice is pretty good, and maybe they were here. They said that they didn't think there was enough evidence because we have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the particular policeman was not in danger because remember, he testified that he pulled his gun. He tried to pull his gun out of his pocket. I don't know. But they did find, it was the Department of Justice that found all these terrible issues of corruption and race in Ferguson. And they brought a lawsuit. And when you bring a lawsuit in the U.S., I don't know if it's the same here, you can have, in this kind of a situation, you can enter in what we call a consent decree. And that consent decree would mean it's an agreement between the city of Ferguson and the U.S. And that consent decree has to be approved by the courts, and that happened. So there are all these changes that have to happen in training, and so that's good news, we think. We'll see. Tamir Rice, the two policemen who went up and shot him were never charged. The city settled a civil suit for $6 million, but never admitted wrongdoing. And the dispatcher who never relayed the correct message about this is probably a kid with a fake gun has not been held accountable. The Justice Department investigated. Once again, we've got another consent decree. Cleveland is supposed to make a lot of changes. Melissa Williams and Timothy Russell, once again, this is in Cleveland. Brelo was acquitted, even though he stood and shot at them. The family's civil suit was settled for, I think it was about $3 million. Brelo was fired, but he brought a suit for reverse discrimination saying that they only fired white policemen. It's like, okay. The court rejected that suit, but he's still trying to get his job back in some kind of a state arbitration proceeding. The Justice Department found that Cleveland had violated many problems, and there's a consent decree there as well. Walter Scott, the policeman was fired. There was a murder trial brought in state court of the policeman, and one of the jurors held out for a mistrial. There was a mistrial. The question was, would they file again? And they have agreed not to retry the case because the federal government brought a civil rights criminal charge against him. It's not murder, but it's very close. It would mean a lot of years in federal prison. He pled guilty to it. Now, the fear is, we're waiting the sentencing. The fear is there was a deal that was made and that he's going to get a light sentence, but we don't really know. Freddie Gray, the charges were filed against a number of police. The first ones were acquitted by juries, and then the city attorney dropped the later cases. There was a Justice Department investigation, and there's a consent decree with Baltimore for violations. Eric Garner, the grand jury refused to indict. There's a possible federal civil rights case right now, but we'll see. The Department of Justice has convened a grand jury to decide whether they're going to bring this federal civil rights criminal claim. But okay, so the good things that we've had are this consent decrees. It doesn't seem that the juries are convicting at all, okay? And maybe it's not even going to go to a jury. But now we have a new administration, and we have a new Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, and he wants to undo all the consent decrees. He's already made that public. Real question as to whether he has the power to do that. Some judges, where these consent decrees have, in other words, if it was in front of that particular judge, it becomes an order of that judge. And what the judges have said is, wait a minute, this is this is a judicial order. The administration doesn't have a right now to get involved. So we'll see whether all the judges agree with that, who have signed the consent decrees. The enforceability of these may depend on individual federal judges. Now, I have to say, bring one aside before we finish. Now, there's a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw who is a very well-known professor who did, those of you know the area of intersectionality. She's fantastic. She's at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. And she has started a group called Say Her Name. And she says that the media focuses on injuries to black men and overlooks black women victims, which seems to be right. That we don't see much in the media. There's only been one black woman over the last 3 years that I remember there being anything about in the media about it. So she's trying to get people to understand that there are black female victims as well, and that many of them have mental health disabilities. Their stories, I think, might be slightly different. I have not dealt with that in this. This just coming up since I wrote the piece, but I just wanted you to be aware that that's there, and there's a whole other area of inquiry that would be very interesting. One example is this Tanisha Anderson, who is a young woman who had bipolar and schizophrenia, and she was killed by the Cleveland police. Cleveland's particularly problematic. because her parents called to get, it's called a welfare check, basically to get her to a hospital, because sometimes you can't control someone who has a schizophrenia or any other mental health disability. And when they called them, the police shoved her into the car, and she struggled to get out. They tasered her, and she was dead by the time she got to the hospital. Okay, so it's up to you guys now.
Thank you very much, Anne, for this fascinating talk. And we will turn to our commentators. The first commentator is Professor Danny Kaplan, who directs the Men's Studies track in the Gender Studies program and teaches at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Bar-Ilan University. He is currently engaged in two main research projects, a study on nationalism through the prism of friendship and sociability, and a study on youth masculinity, ideology, and involved fatherhood. He has published extensively on Israeli men's friendship, militarism, civic association, commemoration, media, and popular culture. He is the author of Brothers and Others in Arms, The Making of Love and War in Israeli Combat Units, published in 2003, and The Men We Love, Male Friendship and Nationalism in Israeli Culture, published in 2006. Dan, thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know much about academic research in law and how legal scholars connect theoretical questions with juridical practice, but I do know how to recognize a groundbreaking approach to connect social theory and real-life problems when I see one. In this study on policing and the clash of masculinities, Professor Anne McGinley follows the path of her previous and really ongoing work, right, on masculinity-based discrimination at work, including the book that just came out recently, where she sets a new agenda for dealing with gender discrimination through the theoretical lens of multiple masculinities, intersectionality, and hegemony, as we just heard. Up till now, the endemic problem of gender-related abuse, harassment, and discrimination in the workplace has been considered by law practitioners almost exclusively through the lens of sexual relations between men and women. So building on masculinity theory, McGinley has reminded us how relations between men are also central to organizational life. And male homosocial dynamics of friendship, mentoring, solidarity, male empowerment, and exclusivity are all part and parcel of almost any work organization. And so are banter and demeaning comments, bullying, and instances of hazing that occur between men almost on a daily basis. Yet because courts have been reluctant to recognize the abuse, it does not cure explicitly because of sex, so much of this behavior escapes legal sanction, as he wrote. Consequently, McGinley has brought to attention the invisible, taken for granted masculine structures that take place in the workplace and connects it to questions of legal practice. In this way, she has demonstrated that masculinity matters, not just in theory, but in real-life problems. This was merely an introductory note to explain the significance of this article, this current study on the clash of masculinities. For here, she makes a similar move, unveiling the invisible masculine structure that help explain not just how men operate in work institutions, but in society at large. If in the United States, Black life matters less, as McGinley explains, it is again because masculinity theory matters, and it matters in public life, more than we tend to acknowledge. So as we just heard, the conflict between police officers and their victim is not only about race and class, but also about masculinity. Specifically, it's a clash between public performances of hypermasculinity enacted from both sides of the race divide, but enacted by groups who are partly share the same side in the class divide, as both come from predominantly blue-collar background and are subordinated to the hegemonic American upper-middle-class masculinity. McGinley observes it's not simply the police performance of hypermasculinity that leads to the deadly result. Rather, it is a mutual performance of hypermasculinity between the policemen and their suspects, each side reacting to what it sees, correctly or wrongly, as an act of humiliation, disrespect, and symbolic emasculation. Building, among others, on the work of criminologist James Messerschmitt, McGinley analyzes the relationship between crime and masculinity, and implicitly male homosexuality. The concept of homosocial enactment was formulated originally by Michael Kimmel, which you mentioned, in his by now classic Masculinity as Homophobia, Fear, Shame, and Silence in the Construction of Gender Identity. Homosocial enactment is the performance of manhood in front of other men, constantly seeking their approval in order to validate one's male status. Messerschmitt posited that crime is in itself a means of performing masculinity and accomplishing approval, and noting the age issue that you described among both white men and black men, especially lower class men, and a different setting in phases in life. To give just one important example, hate crime expands the logic of the homosocial enactment and often replaces it within the context of race and class relations. It is disproportionately a characteristic of working class white youth, permitting them to I quote, to demonstrate their masculine superiority over gays and members of other races. At the same time, these white youth engage less in street crime compared to their working class counterparts of racial minorities. Crime patterns among young black men of poor neighborhoods present a different picture, as we heard. Some embrace the stigma of criminality as an act of resistance. Similar to other youth, this should be viewed as a performance of their masculinity from a position of powerlessness and insecurity. Such practices of resistance range from passive to more active and violent manifestations. Some young black men adopt a non-violent cool pose, for instance, wearing some of the symbols of hip-hop, as a strategy to maintain integrity and demonstrate pride. Others may engage in what Connell and others identified as protest masculinity. That is, they adopt a hyper-machoistic facade involving risk-taking and aggressiveness and engage in homosocial play fighting, using and dealing drugs sometimes, and vandalism. As noted by Connell, protest masculinity enables them to make a claim to power when there are no real resources of power. Turning to the side of the law enforcement personnel, McGinley shows us how police officers typically hail from a white working class environment, in fact the same environment from which hate crime offenders are often likely to come. As police officers cannot access and attain the kinds of jobs and social status available to upper middle class men, they create instead their own version of a tough hyper-masculinity. Following law professor Frank Cooper, McGinley considers how policemen also engage in masculinity contests between them and the people they're policing. To prove their masculinity, they need to demonstrate control over the situation, and they expect respect from others. If their authority is defied by the civilians they engage with, they might feel entitled to elevate their male esteem by engaging in abusive behavior meant to emasculate their opponent. A telling example for this is the story, I think it's one of the only stories that you did not mention, and maybe for a reason, and therefore I'm glad that actually I'm going to mention it. It's not the typical story because it's not a black man from a poor environment. It's Professor Gates, a Harvard law professor, that was stopped by a police officer when entering his own house in a posh neighborhood. The officer was responding to a complaint by a neighbor who thought Gates was an intruder. Although Gates showed the officer his identification, the officer asked him to step out onto the porch, and because Gates initially refused, although later he did not refuse, the officer arrested him for disorderly conduct. As McGinley notes, the report conducted on this incident after the professor, I think, filed a lawsuit or something, concluded they blamed both men and stated that race and class issues were at stake, but did not address the issue of masculinity as a motivating factor. It appears that Gates threatened the officer's male esteem in his role as breadwinner, since Gates, despite being black, attained a much higher social position. Such examples illustrate what urban sociologist Elia Anderson described as a nigger moment. Anderson shows how black persons are automatically associated with the putative danger, crime, and poverty of the black ghetto. When they move to white spaces, they experience on a regular basis occasional instances of acute disrespect from various strangers, which symbolically places them back into the iconic ghetto. Such moments of disrespect lie on a continuum, from racial setbacks at work and other public settings to the more dramatic nigger moments during encounters with the police, and for young men in particular. There is a new Israeli television satire, Nefsu, which is replete with such nigger moments. It is the first local primetime show to feature an Ethiopian Jewish immigrant in the lead role, Yossi Vaza. The star and co-creator plays Gili, a young lower middle-class Ethiopian Jew who is married to a blonde Ashkenazi woman. And in the first episode, he steps out of his suburban house to bring water bottles from his car. And then a police officer driving by stops and demands his ID, which he left inside the house. Moments later, the officer is aggressively frisking Gili against the trunk of his car. The officer stops only when Gili's wife appears and starts taking pictures with her mobile camera and warns him that she will post this on Facebook. It's a new show. If people here don't know it, go see it. It's very well done. Finally, while McGinley emphasizes the importance of masculine identity in these encounters, one could perhaps highlight more the underlying homosocial dimension and its implications on societal solidarity at large. If the workplace represents a homosocial bond between men, a form of production relations occasionally obstructed by abusive behavior, the violent encounters between the male agents of law and order and the male suspects of disorder represent a much deeper cleavage in the wider civil homosocial contract, an almost total breakdown of trust. In effect, what emerges from McGinley's account is that part of this rupture in social relations depends on the existence of two distinct homosocial paths on both sides of this violent encounter. Among the black youth, particularly when engaged in gang-like activities, their cool pose or performance of protest masculinity is directed towards their peers at least as much as it is towards their oppressors, for it enables them to build up or maintain their masculine position within the group. But the police force also operates as a form of fraternity or gang brotherhood. Officers abide by a code of silence and close ranks to protect members from outside investigations. For a policeman to blow the whistle on a fellow officer is to risk losing his status as a man and become ostracized by the group. As McGinley notes, following Harris, this holds true also for black officers who are part of this pack and expect to gain its privileges, its masculine privileges. In this regard, the story of these two groups of men who roam the streets in urban poor neighborhoods at the borders of society is a story of the continuing gang fight that reminds us how fragile civil society can be, and now, despite decades of social progress toward gender equality, society is still haunted by a complex homosocial matrix of power relations between men. Applying the lens of masculinity studies to this burning social problem in American society today, Professor McGinley paves the way to scholars, practitioners, activists, and politicians alike to learn from her insights and to rethink how to disarm and neutralize this explosive male-power relation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dani. Our second commentator is Dr. Ophir Abu, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. He earned his PhD in politics from Brandeis University, where he was also a fellow at the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. In his dissertation, he developed an institutionalist theory that explains why some protest events are more likely to be repressed by the police than other protest events, focusing on the case of Palestinian Arab minority in Israel. So far, his publications have focused on the issue of the identity conflicts and the ways in which they are manifested in public policy as well as in political systems. He is currently involved in two main research projects. The first deals with the relations between the police and Ethiopian Jews in Israel with Professor Guy Ben-Porat and Dr. Fanny Yuval, while the second explores the electoral behavior of Mizrahim in the first 2 decades of Israeli independence. With Dr. Avi Bar-El, please.
Thank you. Thank you again, Professor McGinley, for your excellent presentation and very important topic. I'm going to talk about my research deals with relations between Ethiopian Israelis and the police. Professor McGinley in her paper mentions this issue towards the end of the paper, and I think this is I think what you present in your paper is actually a very fruitful way or fruitful direction to proceed with our research. But let me first explain it. Our research on Ethiopian Israelis and the police is part of a broader research on minorities and the police in Israeli society. We focus on 4 minority groups: Ethiopian Israelis, Palestinian Arab Israelis, ultra-Orthodox Jews, and Russian-speaking minority. The point of view of our research is first of all, is public policy. It's public policy oriented, and it's from the point of view of minority. Now, your research is a bit different because it looks from the it's a look from up, okay, and our look is our approach is bottom up, and so in our research on Ethiopian Israelis, we discovered a paradox in the attitudes. On the one hand, they have very negative perceptions toward the police that are rooted in negative experiences and what we call over-policing, the use of aggressive approach towards the Ethiopian Israelis. But on the other hand, they have equal or even higher perceptions of trust and legitimacy toward the police. It's a very interesting case. And we set out and tried to understand this paradox, and we think our argument is that it has to do with how they perceive their place in Israeli society. So I think in contrast to African Americans, Ethiopian Israelis actually feel part of Israeli society. They feel that that their place in Israeli society is legitimate. They are Jews, and this is a Jewish society. The state should accept them and treat them as any other Jew. And I think that this is a bit different from the case of African Americans because of all the history of slavery and citizenship and Jim Crow, the old Jim Crow. And so that's why when we came to and we asked them about reforms, public policy reforms in the police, they didn't support transforming the police from upside down. They thought that, for instance, recruiting more Ethiopian police officers would do good to the relations between the community and the police. Seeing Ethiopian police officers will alleviate the tensions, will allow them to, some of them said, they will have more solidarity with us, and they will understand. Even they might even speak the language, Amharic. So that was one reform. The other reform was culturally sensitive training. So police officers should be familiar with Ethiopian culture. Now, I have to say that this was a contentious issue among our respondents, because some of them said, no, why should they know our culture? They should just treat us as Israeli citizens. Just our citizenship is enough. We don't need the extra cultural aspect. And actually a lawyer told me in an interview that he told me, the police talk about culture and mentality of the Ethiopians because this is just a way of whitewashing their behavior towards us. But this is not really how it should be. And another reform that was mentioned by our respondents was community policing. This was actually very they support community policing, and we have examples of actually community policing succeeding in alleviating the tensions between the community and the and Ethiopian Israelis. But as I said, I think that, and I have to say that about the Israeli police, you mentioned some reports by the Department of Justice, but here in Israel there was a few months ago, I think 6 months ago, a report by the Israeli Department of Justice Justice Ministry was published about the racism toward Ethiopian Israelis, and one of the chapters dealt with the police. They said the headline for the report was that Ethiopian Israelis suffer from racism, from institutional racism, and the police immediately said, "We don't accept the recommendations." Okay, so this is the attitude of the Israeli police. But as I said at the beginning, I think that masculinity theory, as you presented it here, seems to give us a fruitful direction to examine the relations between Ethiopian Israelis and the police. I have to say that in one of your slides you said black men, victims, equal victims, and white men equal police. Okay? And in Israel this is more complicated, let's say.
Well, it's more complicated in the U.S.
Yeah, I know. But the thing is that I heard from many of my interviewees and respondents that the Ethiopian Israelis are the new black in Israel. Why? Because they replaced the old black, which are we call it in Israel Mizrahim or Oriental Jews, Jews who came from Arab and Muslim countries. Okay, so they were the the previous black, and in fact that the majority of police officers in Israel come from this this background of not only working class background but also Mizrahi background. So the clash between Ethiopians and the police is a clash between the old black with the new black. Okay, and I heard it from many of my interviewees that they suffer the most from the Mizrahi, from Mizrahi people. Their racism is the worst. Okay.
Well, I mean, just to respond to that for 1
Yeah.
minute, it does seem that African Americans who are harmed by police really resent the African American police who are involved in it. So I mean, to the extent, you know, so there's a little bit of this similar situation.
Yeah, but the Mizrahi community and the Ethiopian community are two different
Yeah, I know.
communities.
Yeah.
But Ethiopian interviewees and respondents said that they afraid of Ethiopian police officers because, as you mentioned in your paper, that they have the tendency to go along with police culture and overcompensate, and use even more force than the other white police officers. But I have to say that police officers, and it's very evident in my research that I just noticed it through your research that they said that many police officers use their power to claim something, you know, to claim their masculinity. Now I interpret it like this, but it's very interesting. And one of the Ethiopian respondents said, "What would I would let him treat me like that, and I would not respond? Of course I would respond." So this is like this is the clash of masculinities that you talk about. So this is actually a very interesting topic and a very interesting research, and I congratulate you on this, and I hope we can talk more about it in the future. So thank you so much.
With your permission, Anna, we will open the floor. Thank you, this was great. My question is about the move from policeman to the police, from the personal to the institutional. Okay? Because we keep mixing the use of terms. We just heard that the police is racist or whatever. And what we saw in your presentation has a lot to do with the personal identity of masculinity, and I'm wondering if it's transformed into a way that we can talk about institutional identity that colors a certain public phenomenon.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And
Wait,
go ahead.
One of the reasons that I thought about this is because there's this new book called Locked In of John Platt.
Yeah, I haven't seen that yet. No.
So he comes out against the theory of the word Jim Crow. And he says it's all about prosecutors. He says it's obviously the first encounter with the police is maybe about other things, but the reason for the mass incarceration of African Americans in prisons is because the
That's interesting.
It's not about drugs. It's about an institution that has become very powerful. And a lot of what you're talking about also has to do with forms of power or spiritual power.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just, I keep thinking about his name from The Good Wife.
Oh. Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
So, like, that's a man, right? And he's a prosecutor, he's a governor, and he's tough on crime, and I'm just wondering about this move from the personal to the institutional in terms of how we imagine and how we present our institutions, and this is really good.
Okay, so that's a really interesting question, which could take 5 minutes, probably could take 5 hours, but I'll take 5 minutes. So first of all, I'd like to say, I haven't read the book about the person whose theory it is that it's prosecution. In the U.S., prosecutors have a great amount of discretion, that's true, in making a determination as to whether to charge somebody with a crime. And they also have a lot of discretion along the way about whether they're going to allow them to plead, whether they're going to enter in a plea agreement. And so that is true. The prosecutors have a ton of power. I can't imagine that that's the only reason, and that, all these other things that Michelle Alexander has, I think, done such a good job at demonstrating aren't involved. I think prosecutors is one piece, and you have to start with the police from the very beginning, and then you move through the process. You get the prosecutor, then you get to the judge and the sentencing, and et cetera. So I think it's much bigger than that. I think the question about moving to the institution, between the institutional and the individual, is really interesting, because I find myself doing that all the time. I guess I can answer that kind of quickly in this way by saying that masculinity are themselves an institution that are superimposed on these other institutions that we aren't even aware of, and that actually allow and encourage certain behaviors. So that's how I would answer that, but I don't know if that's really, that's very helpful. But I do think that we need to look at the institutions in order to solve these problems. But the major institution we're talking about here, at least in my view, well, there are two: gender and race. Okay, and those are institutions themselves. But we need to figure out how, as a society, we're going to keep ourselves from being so gendered and so raced in a way so that then other institutions within our society make those part of their institution, and actually, everybody conforms with that. But it starts at birth, because we're being treated and taught to be a certain way and think a certain way. Yeah.
So this is fascinating. I wanted to pick up on something you said about the relationship between feminist theory and masculinities. And I think underlying this project is this idea that if we understand masculinities, then that would actually help the feminist project. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that, if you could theorize a bit more about the relationship between masculinity studies and feminist theory as you see it.
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to. And I hope this is theoretical enough for you, because I find myself backing into things through examples, because I think to me that's easier to understand, to explain. The way I got to masculinity theory is through sexual harassment law. When I was studying it, and I was researching it and doing a lot of work on it, and I started to realize that when I say sexual harassment, what I was focusing on was groups of men in almost all male environment, and the way they were treating women who were newly coming into those environments, not an individual relationship, because that's really not what most of the cases are about. It's like your boss having sex with you. I mean, that's really not what it's about. So what I started to watch it, and started to watch these behaviors that were going on. And as I say to my students, I mean, there's this one case where they were putting used condoms in a woman's sandwich at lunch in, one of these blue collar, everybody goes, and I say to my students, I said, is that really how you would ask somebody for a date? It has nothing to do with being interested in someone, to have a personal relationships with. So what does it have to do with? Well, a certain amount of hostility with that woman being in the workplace or groups of women being in the workplace. And often you see it happening, in these workplaces that are predominantly male, and then women start moving into them. Then I started researching this and starting realizing that in all male workplaces, there's often a man they do that to. And in schools, it's amazing the kind of hazing and bullying that happens on football teams. I mean, you start reading about these things, and the behaviors are almost exactly the same. They always involve, not always, but very often among men, like one person who's being picked on, and they're inserting things in the guy's anus. I mean, I'm sorry to say that, but that's basically what's happening in these. And you think, like, what is this all about? How is this? And so then that's how I got to realizing that actually these relationships among men really are what are affecting. A lot of it has to do with proving, and the next guy in line is raping this kid, and who's on the bottom, only because his friends are watching, and he has to do that, right? Because that's the way he shows he's on top. So I guess, and then of course with women in workplaces, so that's with the men in workplaces. With women in workplaces, it has to do with denigrating the woman and showing that you're not going to be friendly with her. You're not going to, you're going to denigrate her. So it seems to me that's really important to understand that behavior between men, and they often use women. I'm not talking about all men, by the way. I've got two sons who I think are great, right? But they often use women who, in order, as I say, as props, in order to show other men how masculine they are. So I believe that if we're going to get to these behaviors that are negative toward women, we need to understand what men are going through. And some of it's that, is helping men, learn that they don't have to be, they're allowed. And let me say this one other thing. Masculinities theory for me also means that men don't have to be the breadwinner all the time. They don't have to be the person who's under all this pressure not to have any emotions. They can have relationships with their children or their spouse or their partner, whoever it is. And of course they can have, heterosexual and homosexual relationships. I mean, it's about all those things. And I think that once you accept all that, it seems to me that that really helps women. And that's why I see it as a feminist project.
Thank you so much. And we don't have much more time for discussion because we encourage you to come tomorrow to Anne's presentation on masculinities in the working place at 6 p.m. So it's keep you in tension. So thank you. We're going to have this tasty break, I promise. It's going to be really tasty. And come back at 6 for the other presentations. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you. So I would love to get a copy of that and love to get in touch. I'm going to give you my card so you can send me an email and we can get, and I would like to talk, I would love to stay in touch. All of us? Yeah.
And this is Hagai Porat, a student who worked on your paper.